Believing the wrong things about learning Chinese can waste time and lead you astray. Let's explore 8 myths that might be holding you back. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about myths about learning Chinese. Believing in myths can be harmful in several ways. Some myths are about how to learn, so maybe about a specific method being useless or maybe being indispensable. And if you believe in the myth, you might discard a method that you should actually try out, or the other way around, you might stick to something that actually doesn't work. Other myths are about what it's like to learn Chinese as a foreign adult. Some things might be easier than they seem, and other things might be harder. If you want to know more about things that are harder than they seem when learning Chinese, you can check out episode 32, which is all about that. In this episode, we are going to talk about 8 myths about learning Chinese, and I will explain each myth, including some variants, and I will of course also debunk them. All of the things I bring up in this article are wrong in some way, but of course the point is not to explore the misconceptions as such, but also to get at the truth behind them. Sometimes there is also a mirror myth when the pendulum swings so far in the other direction that a new myth is born. And I think the difficulty of learning Chinese is a good example here. So some people claim that it is impossible, which is clearly not the case, and other people then say that it's super easy, which is also wrong. So both these are myths and the truth lies somewhere in between. This is actually the first myth that we are going to explore, namely that Chinese is impossible to learn as an adult. Other variants include, Chinese is super hard, I could never learn it, or you have to be really smart to learn Chinese, or I'm too old to learn Chinese, or maybe adults learn more slowly than children. Adults can absolutely learn Chinese. I started learning when I was 23, for example, and I've met many people who started in their 50s and 60s and still were able to reach their goals for learning the language. Generally speaking, adults are not worse language learners than children, but we do have certain disadvantages. For example, we have busier schedules and that leaves less time for learning Chinese. And also, of course, we have different commitments to family, friends, work, and so on, and most of these commitments are in English or our native language, not in Chinese. Furthermore, many adults also have greater social inhibitions and a heightened self-awareness, which can make it harder to practice Chinese. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we lack a true integrative motivation. Most of us are learning Chinese because we want to, so learning is optional, but for kids, they have to learn the dominant language in the community they grow up, or languages. This is not optional, and so they will learn it. We adults also have some advantages when it comes to learning languages, however. For example, we know a lot more about the world, which helps greatly when, say, reading and listening. And we typically have more effective learning strategies than children do. And we also have stronger analytical skills and also greater self-discipline. As a result, if investing similar amounts of time, adults learn much faster than children. Most native-speaking children don't even talk during their first year or two, but I have met people who started learning Chinese as adults and can be conversational in much shorter time than that. My Chinese was good enough to survive in a master's degree program for teaching Chinese as a second language taught entirely in Chinese after having studied for 5 years or so, and this is of course beyond any 5-year-old native speaker. Children will typically reach a higher level in the end though, especially when it comes to syntax, so how we structure sentences, grammar and so on, and phonology, so the sound system in other words. So Chinese is clearly not impossible to learn as an adult, but there is also a mirror myth here, and people sometimes reverse this and say that Chinese is easy. This is at least as misguided as the main myth here, and as John Paston once said, if someone is claiming that Chinese is easy to learn, they are probably trying to sell you something. Or they might just be trying to counter the idea that learning Chinese is impossible. But just because it isn't impossible, it doesn't mean it's easy. The question of difficulty is something we discussed in episode 155 if you want to listen to more about that. And as usual, I'll put a link to that in the show notes along with links to lots of other things related to the things I'm talking about in this episode. This brings us to myth number 2. It takes 10 years to become fluent in Chinese. And there are many variants of this. For example, it requires 2,200 hours of instruction to reach professional working proficiency. Or becoming fluent in Chinese takes a lifetime. So the myth here is not that Chinese is impossible or very hard to learn. We already talked about that. But there are two other things I want to talk about here. So first we have the number, say 10 years or X years or whatever you pick. And then we also have the fluent bit that I will talk about later. The main problem with saying that it takes 3, 5, or 12 years to reach a certain level is that this says almost nothing about how you actually study and how much you engage with the language. For example, I spent more time learning Chinese in 3 months than I did studying French for 7 years in school. When learning French, I only studied a few hours per week, but when I studied Chinese, I did so full time. So using years to measure how long something takes is just silly. I did a study on hacking Chinese a few years ago where I asked people to estimate how many hours they had spent learning and also how many years they had learned. And the results showed that some students studied 10 times as many hours in the same number of years compared to other students. So what matters here is not how much time has elapsed since you started learning, but rather how many minutes and hours you have spent engaging with the language since you started. I said there are two problems with statements like it takes 10 years to become fluent in Chinese, and the other problem then is the word fluent. Some people take this to mean near native or just super advanced, and other people just mean that you are able to use what you have learned effectively. And the difference between those two can be a factor of 100 or even more in terms of time invested. Finally, any number you give when you talk about how long it takes to do something, even if you specify what you mean by that level, say you use some kind of standard or something, learning is still highly individual and situational. For example, the people at the Foreign Service Institute who reach an advanced level of Chinese after 2,200 hours of instruction are not studying the language under the same circumstances and conditions that you are, and it's also a select group of people to begin with. Next, we have myth number 3. Courses, tests, and textbooks are enough. There are several variants here. Enrolling in a course is guaranteed to teach me Mandarin. If you finish a full series of textbooks, you'll be fluent. Self-study can't replace a structured course. If I just follow this course, curriculum, or teacher, I will become fluent. When I pass HSK 5, my Chinese will be great. There is a common misconception that formal language education in a sense equals language learning, and this has given rise to many strange ideas such as textbooks being necessary, formal courses giving you everything you need, or the HSK being a reliable roadmap for learning Mandarin. None of these is true. I'm not going to discuss each of these in detail here, but I have written articles and recorded episodes about these things before, and so I'll put links in the show notes. I think the problem here is that formal courses and the like make language learning seem manageable and structured and well-behaved, and you think that if I only do what this teacher says or I follow the curriculum here, I will learn Chinese. But this misses an important point that formal education is not necessarily there to help you reach your goals, and it's a fact that many people go through formal courses and get good grades without actually being able to use the language, and that kind of shows that learning the language and formal education are two different things. They are not necessarily opposite, but they are certainly not the same thing. This is a good segue to a mirror myth, namely that courses, tests, and textbooks are useless. So just because there are lots of issues with many formal courses and textbooks are not perfect and tests only can test certain things and so on, this doesn't mean that these things are useless and can't help you learn Chinese. So don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think the main reason people have so bad opinions about formal education is because they compare with learning foreign languages in school. I've heard so many people say things like, I studied Spanish for 5 years in school and I learned nothing. Formal education is a scam. Well, as established earlier, if you do exactly what your curriculum tells you, and this is a non-communicative curriculum, or you have a traditional teacher who focuses mainly on inflecting verbs and the like, well, maybe you can study Spanish or Chinese for that matter for a long time without actually learning to communicate. But this does not mean that all textbooks, all teachers, all tests, etc. are useless. Instead, I think these can be rather valuable. They can provide a lot of structure that many students crave. Yes, it's true that you can learn Chinese without any formal structure at all, but in my opinion, most students still want this kind of structure. Obviously, it's not the only thing you want, but having some kind of solid foundation in a formal course, textbook, or maybe a test series, I think can be valuable. Again, I don't want to dig too deeply into each myth, but if we take textbooks as an example, they actually do provide you with lots of information that you need, language adjusted to your level, etc. And yes, you can find this type of information and language elsewhere, but then you have to go and find it yourself. Whereas if you just buy a textbook, well, then somebody else has done it for you. Is it perfect? Is it the best choice of everything possible when it comes to language and so on? No, it isn't, but then again, you would on your own not come up with the perfect choice anyway. So the bottom line here is that even if many of these more formal structured tools are flawed, they are still useful. Let's move on to myth number 4. You must go to China to learn Mandarin. Again, we have several variants of this. Immersion requires being in a Chinese-speaking environment. Going or living abroad will automatically improve my proficiency. You can't learn Mandarin from home. Or maybe traveling is the best way to learn a language. To put it bluntly, your physical coordinates on the Earth don't determine how much Chinese you learn. This is instead determined by how much you engage with the language, which is only indirectly tied to where you live. In fact, this is very easy to prove because there are people who have reached a very advanced level of Chinese without ever even going abroad. And there are also people who have lived in China for a decade or more and still can't speak the language. This is not strange at all. I mean, if you live in China, but you teach English and most of your social life is in English as well, why would you learn a lot of Chinese? Conversely, you can stay in your home country and listen to a lot of podcasts, watch Chinese dramas, etc., and learn an awful lot of Chinese. This is not necessarily easy, and it does require some of that self-discipline. I said adults had more of than children earlier, but it can certainly be done. For recommendations for what podcasts to listen to, what YouTube channels to check out, etc., again, please check the show notes. So the difference between studying Chinese at home in your home country and going abroad and studying in a Chinese-speaking environment is the effort it takes to immerse. If you stay at home, you need to take initiative yourself, you need to create your own immersion environment, as it were, whereas if you live in China, you just need to go out the door and you have an immersion environment right there. Next, we have myth number 5. A Chinese partner will automatically improve your Mandarin. A few variants of this is, oh, your partner is Chinese, that's why your Mandarin is so good. Dating a native speaker is the best way to learn Chinese. I want to find a Chinese girlfriend or boyfriend to really learn the language. Living with a Chinese person is like having a tutor 24/7. This myth is in many regards similar to the previous one we just talked about your geographical location being less important than people think. Just like your coordinates on the Earth don't determine how much Chinese you learn, whom you are married to or date doesn't either. In both cases, it's about how much you engage with the language, and most of the mixed Chinese foreign couples that I know don't even use Mandarin as their primary language. And then again, it's like living in China without actually using Chinese. That won't really help you all that much. The reason that it's harder to use Chinese with a partner than you think if you haven't tried is that life is actually, surprise, about more than language learning. People usually just want to communicate, and if this is hard to do in Mandarin and maybe easier to do in another language, usually English, people will use this other language instead of Mandarin because it just makes everything easier. Assuming that you are the foreigner here, you might be terribly interested in learning Chinese and want to talk with your partner, but nothing guarantees that they are good at teaching you the language or that they are even interested in doing so in the first place. We did talk about love and language learning in a recent episode, and that was number 237 if you want to check it out. This brings us to myth number 6. Tones aren't important. Native speakers don't really use them when speaking quickly. And again, we have some variants. Mandarin speakers will automatically understand you even if your tones are wrong. Speaking fast is more important than getting the tones right. My teacher, friend, or wife understands me, so my tones must be okay. I'll sound more natural if I stop worrying about tones. So tones are an integral part of Chinese phonology, and I think the best way to think about tones, before you intuitively hear them and can use them yourself, is to think of them a little bit like vowel variation in English. So for example, vowel length or quality. Ignoring tones then is a little bit like ignoring similar vowels in English and saying bit instead of beat, or otherwise mixing them up, which is actually rather common for Chinese people learning English. You can probably understand someone who messes up their vowels like this, but I think you'd agree that it's a step too far to say that this means that vowels are not important in English. Tones is, of course, a very big topic that I can't go into too much detail here, but I have an article and 3 podcast episodes called The Hacking Chinese Guide to Mandarin Tones, where I go into much more details about all of this. To put it briefly, the reason that people can understand you even if you make tone mistakes is that when listening, we rely on context and we can figure things out even if the language is slightly mispronounced or otherwise off. This is particularly true if we're used to listening to a specific person. So, for example, your teacher is very good at listening to foreigners speaking Mandarin, and your partner has also listened to you speak Chinese a fair amount and know your quirks and will therefore be able to understand you, even if other people might not. This is also related to the fact that the more predictable what you say is, the less accurate you need to be. But when you start talking about things that people can't really predict or know, such as when teaching something that is not obvious or telling somebody a story or something where you're trying to convey something that isn't obvious, then tones suddenly become quite important. But as a beginner and when talking in familiar contexts, yes, you can make a lot of tone mistakes and people will still understand you. But this does not mean that tones are not important. I also want to address the misconception that native speakers don't use tones, which they absolutely do. This does not mean that every tone is pronounced fully or that they would look like the pretty graphs in your textbook if they were drawn, because spoken language is complex, and when people speak fast, lots of things happen to tones that don't necessarily happen when speaking slowly. This, however, does not mean that native speakers don't use tones. A good example of this is the third tone, which is almost never a dipping tone, even though many learners think it is. In context, it's almost always a low tone, or when in front of another third tone, a rising tone. There are in fact many other tone change rules that usually aren't taught because you will learn them automatically if you just listen and speak a lot, and so there is little point in teaching them. But as I said, this does not mean that native speakers don't use tones, it just means that they aren't as well behaved as your textbook or teacher might make you think. So make sure you learn tones. The earlier you take them seriously, the better things will turn out for you, the easier people will think you are to understand, and the smoother your conversations will be. Here we also have a mirror myth. One tone mistake will make my Chinese incomprehensible. As I've already mentioned, we can usually figure out what things mean based on context. So sometimes you will hear people bring up various examples in Chinese where you can mix tones up and people won't understand you. For example, we have the famous example of 熊猫, meaning panda, and then 胸毛, which means chest hair, and it would be very embarrassing then if you said chest hair when you actually meant panda. Of course, you don't say these words out of context normally, so if you went to the zoo and you visited the pandas and you talk about it and you accidentally say chest hair, people are not going to think that you meant chest hair, they're just going to think you said panda, but you mispronounced it. So yes, tones are important, but that does not mean that it's the only thing that matters for your ability to communicate. Here we actually have a mirror myth that I want to discuss, which is that single tone mistakes don't matter. This is essentially what I just said, so this is then the other side of that coin, and that is that in certain contexts, tone mistakes really matter, even if it's just one tone on one word. A good example of this is mai and mai, where mai means to buy and mai means to sell. And you can have a conversation with someone and gravely misunderstand what they're talking about, assuming that they're talking about something that you could both sell and buy. For example, a house. This is then not like the panda chest hair example that I brought up earlier, because this could genuinely cause misunderstandings if you mispronounce them. This is because in context both actually make sense, and to figure out which is which you might have to listen for a long time before you realize that the person is saying sell but they are actually meaning buy. I collected more examples of such pairs or triplets that can be mispronounced and lead to actual communication problems, and I'll put a link to that article and episode in the show notes. There is also a second sense in which a single tone mistake can make people misunderstand what you say, and that is if you're talking about something rather complex or if you're a very advanced student and you generally get tones right all the time. I've experienced this myself, where I get one tone wrong on one word in an otherwise perfect sentence, and somehow the native speaker just, what did you say? They were not prepared for that, they could not predict what I was going to say, or they were just jostled by the fact that something sounded off and couldn't connect it to any real meaning. So what I'm saying is that it's not just these specific pairs like my and my that can cause issues in communication. I think all errors can in certain specific cases. Next up, we have myth number 7. Native speakers know everything about the Chinese language. And we have several variants. My Chinese partner said that this is right, so it has to be. If a native speaker says it, it must be correct. Native speakers usually know the best way to explain their language. 99% of native speakers pronounce this word incorrectly. I'm from Beijing, so my pronunciation is the standard. So native speakers are experts in the language they've grown up with. They learn it at home, they learn it in school, and then in wider society, and so on. And this builds a very solid foundation and a feel for how the language works, how it is used, and nuances between different ways of using it, and so on. This also means that if you, as a foreigner, say something in Chinese that doesn't match or fit with their mental model of how the language works, they will react and think that you're saying something that's wrong. This type of knowledge, however, is not the only type of knowledge you can have about a language. For example, being able to use a grammar pattern correctly yourself does not mean that you can explain it. Indeed, these are two completely different things, and the same goes with pronunciation. Just because you can say something correctly, it doesn't mean that you can explain what you just said. This is the difference between implicit and explicit knowledge. So native speakers then have an advantage over second language learners when it comes to the former, but not necessarily when it comes to the latter. Normal people, and here I mean non-linguists, tend to idolize native speakers without realizing that there are many things that they don't know. Here are 3 examples. Explicit knowledge about the language. And this comes from directly studying the language as a subject, or studying Chinese linguistics in other words, and native speakers typically don't do that, and so they lack this type of knowledge. Number 2. Familiarity with the Chinese language in all its glorious variety. Native speakers know the language that they've been in contact with when they grew up and as adults and so on, but the problem is that this language is not the same in all places, in different countries, different regions, or even within the same city. People speak differently for a number of reasons. They have different gender, different age, different professions, different hobbies, different personalities, and so on and so forth. And this is something I think most people who have studied Chinese for a while has encountered, namely a native speaker who thinks that they know everything about Chinese, but it turns out that what they are saying is mostly true for some specific variety or is not generally accepted by other native speakers. The third example of something you can't just assume that native speakers have is knowledge of the standard language. Almost nobody in China speaks perfectly standard Mandarin in their everyday lives. Some native speakers, especially in Beijing, think that they are speaking standard Chinese, but they aren't. An easy way to prove this is that native speakers who take exams to become teachers or news anchors and the like need to study and do so quite hard, even if they are born and raised in Beijing. And this is something that many native speakers who haven't tried simply don't know. The bottom line here is that there are certain things that native speakers are very good at, and then there are certain things that they aren't, and knowing which is kind of important. This is also something we covered in a recent episode, namely number 230, where we talked about what native speakers know about Chinese and what they don't. Before we move on, I want to quickly cover a mirror myth here, namely that native speakers are often wrong. And a good example of this is saying that there are words in Mandarin that 99% of native speakers get wrong, such as 下载 for download, which is actually listed as 下载 with 2 fourth tones in all authoritative dictionaries. So the problem here is that when we're talking about right and wrong in a language, many people just default to thinking that whatever the standard is right or wrong. So we're actually talking about standard versus not standard. And in that case, then saying 下载, as most people do, is wrong, whereas saying 下载 is correct, even though most people don't say it like that. Of course, the counter-argument here is that native speakers own their own language, they are free to say whatever they want, and if 99% of people say something, maybe that should be considered correct instead. Finally, we reach myth number 8. The best way to learn characters is to write them again and again. Here we have 3 variants. Writing characters over and over to build muscle memory is the only way. Mnemonics are shortcuts that don't work long term. Writing by hand is the only way to really learn a character. So this is a myth that can really hold you back if you believe in it, because writing something over and over as a way to try to memorize it is probably one of the worst methods for long-term retention. Rote learning of characters has several problems, and let's have a quick look at 4 of them before we wrap up this episode. The first is that it only involves superficial processing, which leads to worse results. If you're writing the same character over and over, you're not even trying to engage your long-term memory, and so you will not remember how to write it long-term by doing so, unless you write it an awful lot. And like I said, this is an inefficient method and it's terrible compared to many other methods. That does not mean that it's impossible to learn things by rote, it just takes several times longer. What you should do is to use active recall instead. You should not see what you're trying to recall. You look at the character, you cover it up, and then you write it. And then you do the same thing, but you wait longer, and maybe you can use flashcards or some other trick if you want to do this more systematically. Number 2, it does not encourage understanding of how the writing system works. So one of the most important principles when learning anything is to understand it. Things we understand and that we can connect with things we already know are much easier to learn than things that are just essentially a jumble of strokes. If you write something over and over, you don't learn anything new at all. Whereas if you look this character up, you check the components, you figure out what these components are doing in this character, you're learning something about that character, and you gradually also build an understanding for the Chinese writing system, which will aid you greatly when you learn more characters further down the road. Number 3, it masses repetitions together, but research clearly shows that spaced repetition is better. If you write characters over and over, there is very little space between each time you write it, so you're not even challenging or engaging your long-term memory, as I mentioned earlier. But if you spread the reviews out over time, reviewing becomes much more efficient and you can learn many times more than if you mass them together. You can achieve this effect naturally by, say, reading, where you get some kind of natural spaced repetition, or you can use a flashcard app that has some kind of spaced repetition algorithm that helps you schedule when you're supposed to review what. And finally, number 4, it ignores powerful memory techniques that are well suited for learning characters. Our brains have not evolved to learn abstract things such as written symbols, but there are different techniques called mnemonics that you can use to remember things much better by making the abstract more concrete and linking things together in a meaningful way, or in a way that stands out and is therefore easier to remember. So to summarize, don't write characters over and over. It is a terrible way to learn characters. The only situation where I would consider doing this is if penmanship is your main goal. So, I mean, writing neat characters or beautiful characters. But even so, there is research into spaced repetition and motor skills, and it turns out that spacing things out when practicing motor skills is actually also a good thing. So, even if you want to improve your penmanship, you should still spread it out. But if you're a beginner and this is the first time you see this character, feel free to write it a few times to get the hang of it. That is not a problem. But as a way to remember characters, writing them over and over again is really bad. Okay, so those were 8 myths about learning Chinese that are holding you back. Of course, I don't know if you in particular are held back by all these 8 myths, but I think that some of them should apply to most listeners. Maybe you did believe in one of these myths earlier, but now you've realized the error of your ways. Or maybe you think I'm wrong and one of these myths is actually not a myth. Regardless, head over to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment to let me know. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.